All right, well, welcome, everyone. This is the Interfaith and Ethnic Dialogue panel number 2. And the first speaker, we're just going to go in the order that's printed in the program. The first speaker is Paul Rowe with his talk entitled Christian-Muslim Relations in Egypt in the Wake of the Arab Spring.
So I make sure that I put my middle initial in my name. I always thought that I had a relatively unique name. And it's fairly common in certain ethnic circles, but I thought it was fairly unique. And then I found out there's a Paul W. Rowe who also writes on politics in Canada. So I didn't, I thought political science was a narrow enough field that there wouldn't be too many Paul Rowes, but there are at least 2 in Canada. So look out for that. In case you read something that doesn't sound like something I would say. It may be the other Paul Rowe. So today, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to summarize my paper on the PowerPoint and speak a little bit extemporaneously about it. I'll try to watch the time and make sure that I don't go over as well. So I start the abstract and the paper with a quote from Ala Swami, who's if you haven't heard the name, he's a novelist and an opposition agitator, an opposition editorialist in Egypt. And writing before the revolution, before 2011, he wrote this. He said, "Justice alone will protect the cause. They cannot demand justice for themselves to the exclusion of others, and they cannot obtain it alone at the expense of the Muslims. Justice must be achieved for all, and justice comes about only through democracy, for democracy is the solution." Democracy is the solution was his tagline for everything, all of his editorials, in a direct opposition to the Islamists who say that Islam is the solution. So that's the interesting part of that whole thing. So is democracy the solution for the cause, is the question that then arises from his editorial piece. He was again writing before the Arab Spring when he said this. And he's reacting in a sense against the typical approach that Christians have taken toward the state in Egypt. The Coptic Orthodox Church, again, I'm not sure if I'm speaking to an audience who's really well aware of this context or not. The Egyptian church, the ancient Egyptian church is called the Coptic Orthodox Church. It's common for you to refer to Egyptian Christians simply as Copts. They do so among themselves. And they also don't tend to differentiate between the Coptic Orthodox Church and other churches. When they say Copts, they're simply talking about Egyptian Christians. And even though about probably 90%, 95% of them would say they are devotees of the Coptic Orthodox Church. So the Coptic Orthodox Church had developed this partnership with the regime, where the regime would recognize the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch, known as a Pope, as the representative of Coptic interests. And it gave some predictability, I'd suggest, and it allowed the church to have the leading role in determining the status of Copts and the representation of Coptic interests. And I call this the Neo-Milli model. I refer to it in that way because it resurrects, or it replaces the old, it brings back to life the old system that applied during the Ottoman Empire, which was called the Milli system. The Coptic Orthodox Church, because it had this special relationship with the regime, was pretty ambiguous when the Arab Spring revolts happened, and so they weren't particularly happy about the idea that the regime might be overturned. And so the church generally tried to resist the idea, but most ordinary Copts did like the idea of trying to get rid of Mubarak, even if they were a little bit concerned about this whole idea of democracy. And so most Copts on the street tended to actually support regime change, and very large numbers came out to Tahrir Square in the protests, and in fact, among some of the youth who were spearheading the protests, there were lots of Copts who were also involved. Most of them, again, young. We'll get back to that a little bit. So I suggest from the outset of the paper that there's perhaps 2 different models that we can understand for how Copts are going to relate to the state in the future. One being simply a perpetuation of this old system whereby the church represents Coptic interests, and where the state recognizes the relevance of the Coptic Orthodox Church as their representative. And the second model, which I'm suggesting, is going to become the more strengthened one over the course of several years, and I'll try to get back to why I would say that, is that the Republican system will become stronger, which means that Copts will begin to represent their interests as individuals. They will begin to represent their interests as groups. They will, in other words, they will challenge the role of the Coptic Orthodox Church in being their representative, their official representative. They'll do this in a couple of different possible ways. One way is that you could go through the development of a simple sectarian party, the development of a Coptic party, as it were. Most Copts tend to tell me this is a bad idea. Okay, Copts are a very small minority, depending on who you talk to. They're anywhere between 5 and 15% of the population. I'd say somewhere around 10% of the population. And they realize that as a minority in a mostly Sunni Muslim country, they're trying to defend their own interests in this way is not going to work very well for them. And it only tends to be really divisive. That's the way that Copts tend to think of it. Although there are some people who've tried to make this, take this approach over the years, who tried to create sort of a Coptic political party or a Coptic political movement. The other possibility is the participation of Copts in the liberal opposition movement, which is something that we increasingly are seeing actually today. And so overall, I'm making the argument that we see the erosion of Model 2 in favor of Model 1 in favor of Model 2 since the time of the Revolution. I think it's useful to know that at the very beginning of the Revolution, before any protests were taking place in Tahrir Square at all, when they were just gathering steam in Tunisia at this point, there was an attack on a church in Alexandria called the Qadisiyyin, or Two Saints Church in Alexandria. There was a bomb blast that went off just outside the church. There were 23 people killed in this bomb blast, most of them Copts, and dozens were injured as a result of this bomb blast. Again, bomb blasts like this you can't make sure that only Copts get injured, okay? So obviously Muslims as well get injured in these attacks, but they're targeted attacks to try to attack. And in this case, it actually took place during a service that was going on within the church. The government blamed the Islamists. They said that there was some group based in Gaza that was responsible for it, and they were going to root out and find the Islamists. And they used this as an opportunity to rally around a flag. I don't want to say this too pointedly, but I think a lot of Copts would put it more pointedly than I would. The timing of this, at the time of the Tunisia protests, when they were gathering steam, and sort of the thought that maybe this could happen in Egypt as well, makes the suspicious among us wonder why this was so well timed, especially in the case of this situation, because it was such a violent attack. There have been lots of attacks against Copts over the years, but this was probably one of the worst attacks until the next one that's going to take place, as I'm going to talk about in about a year, to target Copts at all. It gives this opportunity for the government to say, especially to governments abroad, in the United States and elsewhere, you need us in charge because we can protect the Copts, because there is a serious threat out here toward them. So my suggestion is that perhaps there was more to this story than the government would have wanted us to believe, because later reports suggested that it was just a setup by the government in an attempt to preempt foreign support of the opposition, already gathering as a result of the protests taking place in Tunisia at this time. Nevertheless, the late patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church, as I suggested, was very cautious about trying to support the Arab Spring movement. Shenouda, the late pope, he died last year. Shenouda was pope, or was the patriarch when the protests were gathering steam. He had come to an operating assumption with the government where he would be able to represent Coptic interests, and the government would recognize the significance of the church. And I go into some discussion in the paper about how this took place. It essentially arose after Pope Shenouda had been imprisoned and sent into internal exile back in the early 1980s as a result of his agitation out in the streets. And so he essentially came to this agreement with Mubarak, who was the new president. Sadat had been assassinated, so he was able to reconstruct his relationship with the government. essentially said, we're not going to agitate against you as long as you continue to accept my role in representing the church's rights. And so, because the church was able to do this, increasingly over the 1990s, it gave them an opportunity to undermine any attempt by lay movements among the Copts to become a more important political force. And it created an unofficial alliance between the state and the church. So this is the situation that obtains when the Arab Spring movement breaks out in Cairo. And it essentially pits a group within the Coptic Orthodox Church of the youth, many of whom identify with the ideas that the youth themselves are bringing to Tahrir Square in 2011. So there's a parallel youth movement that arises among Copts at this time. So there's a parallel Shabab organization that sort of develops as a result of what goes on in Tahrir Square in early 2011. Shabab, again, for anyone who's not familiar with Arabic, that simply means youth. Okay, Shabab is the youth movement. So following the success of the revolution in February 2011, Copts suddenly feel like they are liberated, just like everyone else. There's a period of time in which everyone feels like anything's possible, right? So the Copts all of a sudden begin to assert rights that they have generally, kept free of demanding over the last 20 or 30 years. Probably the most significant of these is about church construction. Church construction in Egypt has been governed ever since the 1930s by this edict that was actually an Ottoman edict. But they added a few strictures. Added strictures too in 1935, I think it was. And this edict makes sure that it's very difficult to build a church, essentially, in Egypt. And then beyond that, there are lots of informal ways in which the Egyptian government has always made it very difficult for Copts to alter their churches. Up until the late 1990s, in fact, you needed a presidential permit to either build a church or to refurbish a church. And Copts like to tell a story, which is sort of a black joke, which is that they could never replace the toilet seat in the church without a presidential edict, which is always very difficult to get. Can you imagine a president having to deal with paperwork that allows you to sign off on a toilet seat being fixed in a church? It's a black joke, but it was blacker because it was true. Okay, the reality was that they could not actually refurbish a church in any way without without the support of the president. So what they do after the end of the presidential era is, well, all of a sudden, there's no president anymore, right? There's SCAFs in charge, so we can just start building, right? So they start constructing stuff all over the place. Churches suddenly, there's a building that was always used as a church, but all of a sudden they put a sign outside to say it actually is a church, put a cross on the front of it, that kind of thing. And this creates a lot of problems in various different places all over Egypt. And this is what you saw basically over the year from 2011 to 2012, a lot of incidents between Muslims and Copts, where Muslims are saying, you're taking the law into your own hands by doing this, and Copts respond by saying, it was never really right for you guys to demand that we have presidential permission in the first place, and so it turns into feuds in a lot of different places. In order to respond to these incidents, some of which were very violent, in particular on the west bank of the Nile in I want to say Mobilization, but it was actually Mbaba. There's a church that became kind of the center of an incident between a group of Salafists and Copts who were, there's this long festering dispute about a lady who was said to have converted to Islam but has then recanted. And so this led to the burning of a church, essentially in Mbaba. This started a series of demonstrations that Copts began to bring to the national television headquarters in Maspero, which is a suburb of Cairo. And this group styled themselves, or they called themselves, the Maspero Youth Union. And they continually went to, in mid-2011, throughout the summer and the early fall of 2011, this group kept persistently going to the television headquarters and having this big demonstration saying, that what's going on in these places is not right, and we demand Coptic rights to refurbish our churches in the way we wish to. Here's a spokesman for the group. He says, in an interview, he says, we aim to be a political face for Egyptian Christians And I think what I want to highlight here is the way in which he's trying to say that we don't want the church hierarchy to continue to represent our interests. Okay, so he says, doing so away from the church. We're not trying to be leaders in place of the church, but rather to show people they don't need to run to the church when they meet with difficulties. The problem is that the Christians do not have leaders in any significant way. We must have these leaders. We must have them outside the church, this guy, Fanny Phillips says. So the demonstrations continue, and they lead eventually in October to a really tragic event, what's known among Copts as the Maspero Massacre of the 9th of October in 2011. What happens essentially is it's an evening, and a group of these demonstrators all go to the television headquarters once again to do what they've been doing several times. And there are all sorts of disputes about what exactly happened. Shots rang out, and all of a sudden the military is trying to clamp down on what the demonstrators are doing, and eventually 26 people are killed in the melee that happens during this evening. If you've been watching what's been happening in Egypt over the last couple of years, these kinds of things are happening fairly frequently now. It's not quite as frequent at this point. So these sort of dust-ups between the security forces and the people. Add to the fact, of course, is this idea, first of all, that the police are illegitimate from the past regime. They're all a bunch of appointees from the past regime. And the military doesn't really want to step in and be the bad guy at all times, but at this point, they did. They decided to step in. So what did this do? This eroded public confidence among the Copts in the military. Up until this time, the Copts have always kind of thought of the military as being their friends. They were typically friends of the Mubarak regime, which was always personally committed to the security of the Copts and always kind of made this one of their issues, even if back behind the scenes they were doing other things that just set it up. And so the Copts no longer trust the military, but they also are concerned about the possibility of who else would come along the scenes to take over. Along about the same time, however, we have the first legislative assembly elections. So the Maspero incident actually galvanizes Copts on one hand, and on the other terrorizes them. Okay, so on one side they're very fearful, and on the other side they start thinking we need to represent ourselves. We need to be doing so, but perhaps not in these big demonstrations. Interestingly enough, although it was always considered unlikely that Copts would be elected in the legislative assembly elections, actually several were, a handful were elected in the elections under generally under the liberal opposition banners, and then a few were appointed. Mubarak had always had this idea that he would appoint. There was a certain number of members that he was allowed to appoint to the Majlis, to the assembly, and he would always sort of appoint 5 Copts. And so 5 Copts, once again following tradition, got appointed to the legislative assembly elections, several of whom make it into the Constituent Assembly drafting the new constitution. Over the next few months, therefore, there's a little bit more sort of growing optimism that maybe they will be able to participate in the new Republican administration. However, the death of Pope Shenouda, which occurred in March of 2012, contributed to the erosion of the church's role. Okay, so once again, what I'm making the argument is that the church is becoming less and less significant in representing Coptic interests, and instead Copts themselves, lay Copts essentially, are becoming more and more significant. So Shenouda dies in March of 2012, going into the period of the presidential elections. Copts are no longer represented in that sense by a strong established leader. Shenouda had been the head of the church for 40 years, and he was known as a very strong leader. Copts have had very venal, very not particularly gifted popes over the years. Kyrillos, his predecessor, and Shenouda himself have generally been viewed by the Copts as being excellent leaders, very good leaders. Even if you disagreed with them, they tended to think of them as very good leaders of the church. So he disappears from the scene. And then Mohamed Morsi, the president, gets elected in June in an attempt to make sure that there's kind of a broad-based support for his new administration. He makes this big promise to say, then you will appoint a Coptic assistant president, which he does, a guy by the name of Samir Morkos, who's a kind of upper-class bourgeois Copt. He's not really, he's trusted by people, but he's not sort of a man of the people. About this time, Yusuf Sidhom is quoted, and this is from the New York Times. Yusuf Sidhom is the editor of the Watani, which is the kind of Coptic newspaper, daily newspaper in Egypt, weekly newspaper in Egypt. And he makes this comment to the New York Times. He says, the relationship now between the church and state has changed dramatically in the interim period, he's saying, since the Arab Spring protests. Before, there was this unspoken pact between Hosni Mubarak and Pope Shenouda that the champion of Coptic Christian interest would be delegated exclusively to Coptic Orthodox Church, and that is no longer the case. So, I'm going to just conclude with a few observations about how things have fared since Mohamed Morsi's election. And then we can get back to, if you have any more specific things, I can respond to any questions. So this period of optimism that kind of, I would suggest, starts with the legislative elections. It started optimism, I would think. But I think you could say there's a certain amount of optimism that grows until when Mohamed Morsi becomes president. First of all, most Copts don't support Morsi. I would say, by and large, in my conversations, I would guess probably 70% would have voted for Ahmed Shafiq in the second round, which was the Mubarak era holdover. So they were not particularly enthused about this idea of Mohamed Morsi becoming president. So when he makes these initial outreach to the Christian community, it kind of, again, strengthens the optimism that maybe it won't be so bad under the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe they're more trustworthy, especially than the Salafists are, who've been coming along and burning our churches every once in a while. So there's a short period of optimism. This basically disappears at the end of 2012, probably most significantly because of the decree that Morsi came out back in November 2012, which eliminated most of his support most of the positive attitudes toward Morsi amongst anyone who's an opposition supporter, but more importantly, alienated him entirely from the Copts because. Beyond the fact that there were protests now gathering in the streets against what Mohamed Morsi had done in issuing this decree, he also loses basically all of his high-level Coptic support. So this includes Samir Morkos, that I talked about before, the assistant president, basically within the week after Morsi comes out with his decree, says, I'm not working with you anymore. Anyway, I feel like, he essentially says, I haven't been given any responsibilities, you haven't really been respecting me anyway, and so I'm just going to resign entirely. Coptic members of the Constituent Assembly drafting the Constitution drop out, say they're not going to participate anymore, and they are summarily replaced by a bunch of Muslim Brotherhood appointees in the Assembly. And then lastly, and perhaps most significantly, Rafa Habib, who's this guy, Copt, who's been participating in the Wasatiyah movement among Islamists for many, many years, probably 15, 20 years. Says, and he had been appointed as one of the deputy leaders of the party in an attempt to make sure that Copts felt like they could actually support the Muslim Brotherhood. He also drops out and says, I'm not coming back to politics. I'm staying out of politics from here on in December. So the other thing is that in November as well, the patriarch is replaced. A new patriarch is elected. And this is Pope Tawadros II. Tawadros, this now emboldens the Coptic community. Now we have a new leader. The other interesting thing about Tawadros is he's relatively young. When I say relatively young, among church leaders in places like Egypt, that is obviously a relative term, but he's 60. Okay, so he's 60 years old. He may have a long term in office. And he's very vigorous as well. He's an intelligent guy, very vigorous. And so there's a new patriarch. All of the articles that come out, basically, when the patriarch is appointed, quote him, and there's very kind of vague things that he says in his interview before his own selection. All of these things say, oh, he's going to be apolitical. He's not going to be engaged in politics. He's going to try to step back. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that, because in fact, in January, in one of his very first public initiatives as patriarch, Tawadros goes to Dar al-Muharraq in Upper Egypt, which is the place where his predecessor had never gone, basically for 30 years. And it's an area which has often been an area of Islamist attacks on Christians. Back in the late 1990s in particular, was where the sort of the fight between the Islamists and the government was centered. He goes there in February of 2013, just basically 2 weeks ago, and he deliberately challenges the government over the new constitution. He actually makes this public statement to the press, and of course this is a big press scene. They're all pressing upon him to make statements at the monastery because, as I say, none of the popes had dared to go there. For the Pope in particular had never dared to go there in 30 years. And so he makes this public statement saying essentially the Constitution is illegitimate and needs to be adopted, it needs to be changed. And so there is some question as to where that means we're going from here. I'll just kind of finish with a few conclusions. So my general conclusion is that the partnership between the church and state that we saw before under Shenouda has now come under strain. The instability and uncertainty that abounds under the military and Muslim Brotherhood regimes has contributed to this. In addition to that, we see challenges being laid, direct challenges to the church authority to represent the interests being made by Copts themselves, by Coptic laity. We also see the ideal of republicanism as a neutral space where Copts may participate as a growing idea, an idea that the Copts themselves are really embracing. That's why they participate in the Arab Spring protests. They want to simply be Egyptian citizens and not simply be under the rule of the church. Maybe I should mention really quickly as well here, one of the issues that comes up here is that the church does not allow people to divorce. Okay, that becomes a very big issue among Copts. They would like a civil code that is not ruled by the church. A lot of Copts would like a civil code that's not ruled by the church so they can simply get divorced. And this adds a lot of tension between both Muslims and Copts in Egypt. And then finally, the death of Pope Shenouda means that we're entering into a period where the new Pope has to kind of negotiate with the laity about how this is going to work. And in general, I would say to you that Tewodros seems to support this idea of Copts as equals. I think I wouldn't go so far on to allege to suggest that I know the mind of the Pope, but one thing that would be easy for him to say is that if they develop a civil constitution or a constitution that allows them to have a personal status law outside of the church, it actually would release him from a lot of the burden of having to maintain this policy on divorce and stuff like that, which I'm sure he himself would not want to change. He would not want to change the policy. Then finally, democratic government is fledgling, but Copts are taking up citizenship politics. I think it's important to understand that it's very common for me to speak to people here in North America who will essentially argue that Copts are victims and that they are just recipients of persecution. And what I like to stress is actually the way in which Copts are able to represent their own interests in Egyptian society, and this has actually become more and more a possibility for Copts ever since the Arab Spring. And a couple of the pieces of evidence that I'd like to use for this is the growth of the youth movement, which is challenging the authority of the church, and then the actual way in which individual Copts themselves are participating in political party politics. For example, in the liberal opposition today, there are several Copts that we can identify who are leading members of the liberal opposition, if not any longer in the Muslim Brotherhood. So, thanks.
Next up, we have Ali Zeynel Gokpinar, and can I help at all, or are you? Oh, you're good. Okay.
So, good morning everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I would like to thank you to Professor Paul Rowe because he gave all the background and there are lots of many overlapping points, so that I'm not going to keep my talk really long. So my actually topic is the Coptic ethnopolitical mobilization between 2005 and 2012. So this is my first presentation in the United States, and I hope it will be fun. The topic is that Coptic ethnopolitical mobilization between 2005 and 2012, and I'm trying to examine to what extent did the Copts mobilize in this process, or did they mobilize, and what are the causes of this mobilization? Why didn't they mobilize, for instance, in the past, but now? So the research questions are: why and how did the Copts mobilize from 2005 and 2012? What kind of role did the religion, institutions, and socioeconomic factors play? How did the institutions respond to the Coptic mobilization? And the rationale of this research is that as Professor Rowe mentioned, actually there is a tendency in the Western scholarship to treat the Copts as victims and persecuted minority. Actually, Paul Cedra, who is also a scholar in Canada, he recently, in early 2000s, he published an article saying that the Copts have become actors. And then he also published another article saying that actually we need to revisit the history of the Copts and the political studies on the Copts, because we cannot maintain showing the Copts as a persecuted minority and victims. And then there is also the problem of the scarce literature on the Copts, and except there are many Coptic scholars working, new generation Coptic scholars working on this issue, but there are problems. And in the past, actually, there was a problem. Scholars studying Coptic problems were actually mentioning all the time the Islamization of Egypt, which is a problem actually because they were falling into the trap of the Mubarak regime. Because Mubarak regime's one of the policies was that once the Islamists were removed or co-opted, that there will be no Coptic problem. Whereas actually the reality was that there was an entente or a modus vivendi between the church and the Mubarak regime. And there's also the neo-millet system and the personal status law that are actual problems. And the third reason that I'm doing this study is to demystify the role of religion, politics, and socioeconomic factors, especially in the last 7 years in Egypt. So this was part of my master's thesis in Turkey, and I first reviewed the literature. Then last year at this time I was in Cairo doing some interviews with Coptic activists, government officials, and NGOs. And I used two theories actually, the ethnopolitical mobilization theory of Ted Robert Gurr and Barbara Harf, and then use Jonathan Fox ethno-religious conflict model. And the reason that I'm using this theory is that I don't want to rely only on one theory, because there is a tendency to label the conflict in Egypt as sectarian, whereas I think we always should think about and review, consider what is the conflict about, because there are some sectarian cases in Egypt, but at the same time some of the attacks or some of the conflicts are not sectarian in their nature. So, and I had some additional variables, which is the first one is the geographical difference, which I find very important according to my research, and I will mention it back. So according to this theory, actually, that it is based on livelihood, and it measures it uses different variables here, and they say the degree of group discrimination is very important here, and they say the more a group is discriminated, the more likelihood they will protest. They will develop a stronger group identity. The stronger a group identity is, that they will actually develop a degree of ethnic group cohesion. And then there are some other variables here, like the type of the political environment. Are they living in a democracy? Are they living in an authoritarian regime? Which is, in the last case, I'm using a competitive authoritarian regime variable, because there were some facade democratic reforms and some neoliberal economic reforms as well. And also, we have to look at the severity of the governmental violence, which is because most of the time in Egypt you don't see that there is government violence except some certain cases. But at the same time, you should look at to what extent there is repression, and what kind of repression, and what is the logic of the repression there. And then there is the international status of regime. For instance, in the Egyptian case, the United States financial support because of the agreement with Israel. And then there's the extent of the external support to minority groups, which is, in this case, there are lots of Western and Christian organizations giving not financial, but at least, how to say, at least support in terms of pushing US government, pushing French government to actually announce their concerns about the Copts in Egypt. And then the ethno-religious conflict model actually follows by and large the same logic, but it actually the problem with the first study is that Tetraberger argues that religion and culture is rarely the source of the conflict, whereas actually it could be, and there are some studies, some research showing that religion and culture are could be causes of the roots of the conflict. So I'm actually dividing my study into two periods. The first one is between 2005 and 2011 till the January 25 revolution. And the reason for it is that in 2005 there were the first elections in which some of the Muslim brothers actually entered the parliament, the Egyptian parliament. And then there are some neoliberal reforms here, which actually was a break point in the Egyptian history and political landscape. So I begin my analysis with the fissures in the institutional relationship following Maurice Tadros. The thing is that Pope Shenouda and Mubarak had some problems over the years, especially beginning early 2000s, and especially after the sectarian attacks and someone called Max Michel claiming another Orthodox church in Egypt, it actually created a problem between these two leaders. And then there is the factor here of the Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of Interior and the police department, to some analysts, they actually, according to some analysts, they saw any role in the relationship because there was the impact of the Gamal Mubarak, who was Mubarak's son and who was thought to be seeking the role of his father. And then there was, in 2007, Mubarak's attempt to amend the personal status law. Actually, Professor Rowe talked about it. So according to personal status law, the Copts cannot divorce, cannot marry, or cannot convert without the permission of the church. And the Copts themselves actually want a civil code, and they want to be considered as equals. And also, then we have to look at the Egyptian constitution. According to second article, it says Sharia is one of the primary sources of the law. So if the personal status law and the second article is amended, then there will be no actually reason for the neo-millet system. It will be actually destroyed, and there will be no reason for the Orthodox Church to actually prevent such marriages, such divorces, or conversions. Then there is the fact that religion actually played a role of catalyst in terms of the increasing sectarian violence, especially attacks against the Orthodox churches in Upper Egypt, and political rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually gained more than 80 seats in the parliament after 2005. So there is the perception of threat among the Copts, which actually kind of mobilized them that they have to think about their future. Then there's the fact that the paralyzed response of the state, which I frame as the blaming foreign powers, denial of sectarianism, and forced reconciliation. Blaming foreign powers refers to the fact that actually whenever a sectarian attack happened or occurred against the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Mubarak regime would say that actually this is the work of the foreign powers. They are trying to actually create conflict in Egypt so that we will be an unstable country. Then there is the fact that they always denied sectarianism. The rule of law was not enforced in any of the time in the 40 years relationship. And there was also, especially in Upper Egypt, the forced reconciliation issue. So Upper Egypt actually compared, the geographical difference is unbelievable between Upper Egypt and Cairo and Alexandria. So in Upper Egypt, actually, Islamists are gaining more ground because most of the people in most of the Islamists in Egypt, somehow they were working in Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia. And many of the Copts that I interviewed told me that actually there is an important influence of the Salafis in this field, in this region. And the government actually, whenever a sectarian attack or some land conflicts occur in Upper Egypt between the Muslims and the Copts, the governor of the region would intervene and force both sides to actually reconcile between themselves without actually taking the case to the court and implementing the rule of the law. So there are always recurrences, and according to Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, between 2008 and 2010, there were at least 60 recorded attacks, which actually are not new attacks, but they always recur. So then there's the fact that actually the Egyptians since 2005, they started with the kafaya and the labor movements. They discovered the street politics, and the street politics became the normal for Egyptians. And the Copts actually articulated their own discourses, their demands for justice, equality, and equality and democracy to that of the labor movements, to that of the kafaya. And as I said before, facade democratic and economic reforms actually helped the Copts in the sense that there were new media outlets established by the Copts. The social media also played played an important role in this venue because it provided a Coptic space to them, to the Coptic community, in which the Coptic community, the Copts of Egypt and the Copts of the Coptic diaspora interacted and learned from each other. So there's a new book that came out after my research. Elizabeth Iskender argues that actually that even though that this was a Coptic space and an alternative space to that of the government and that of the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church managed to somehow to intervene even in this field. But exchange of ideas and opinions actually had an important impact because there were some major TV channels that were established by the Copts, and these actually published articles or broadcasted videos or soap operas on sectarian lines. So after the January 25 revolution, I find that actually that the Coptic ethno-political mobilization chain transformed. And the transformation is that they are no longer part of the broader Egyptian mobilization. They are still there, but at the same time they are seeking their own interest. And it is very important here, as Professor Rowe mentioned, the Maspero Youth Union was established before the January 25 revolution, but they didn't have this name, and they started to monitor, for instance, which is very interesting, the sectarian attacks, and they have a vast network of people in almost every region, every village that Copts live. So after the January 25 revolution, there is the problem of insecurity and state-sponsored attacks, which is for instance, the Maspero, and it has become now a very symbolic for Copts because the court just actually decided that despite the fact that 24 Copts were killed that day, they blamed 2 Copts and jailed 2 Copts for stealing arms from the army. And perception of threat increased, and there was also a perception of opportunity. The perception of threat has to do with the rise of the Muslim Brothers and the Salafis. So what to do? I mean, as Professor Rowe said, that the institutional arrangement actually now is no longer possible, or at least it's not as strong as it was in the past. The Coptic community started to look for alternatives, and they saw the opportunity that they could change their destiny by taking part in this process and in the constitution writing process. So, especially I found, for instance, I interviewed a government official, for instance, the government, the prime minister, the last prime minister of the interim period actually established an early warning and conflict prevention commission, which did not take action. But I interviewed one of the people working for this commission, and she told me that actually whenever they investigated a case, they found that government officials, security officials, were involved in sectarian attacks against the Copts. And all in all, I found that there is increasing level of mobilization here, which in case that during this interim period, if the new constitution does not address the grievances of the Copts, there might be more problems than coexistence. And actually, I was reading some articles last night, and I just saw that the youth started to. They were already challenging the Coptic Church after the revolution on non-religious grounds, but they now even started to challenge the church on religious grounds. And they want the church, for instance, last night I was reading the article, they want the church to be apolitical, to leave its entente with the political system, and to let the Copts do whatever they want. And they are talking of the power-sharing arrangements or forming a Coptic political party, which is likely to create more problems than resolving the conflict. So maybe I should also talk some time for the youth protest. So how did they do it? They actually used the youth protest and the neighborhood protest. The youth protest actually, if you ever go to the go to Cairo and you go to Shubra Al Khaimah, then you will see that the neighborhood is basically populated by the Copts because of two reasons. Almost all Copts are coming from Upper Egypt, migrated from Egypt, because there are, the church provides social service, and then there is the fact that there are lots of factories around the neighborhood. And the Coptic ethno-political movements started their protests from this neighborhood so that they could get more support, and they marched to Tahrir or some other places wherever they wanted to go. And then there is the fact that the church didn't want the Mubarak regime to fall, but at the same time they couldn't say that you should not go and protest to their own community, because this would undermine their own legitimacy. So, and I found that there is the discourse of the Coptic ethno-political movements has transformed from religion and equality to proportional political representation. And finally, I'm making some I'm actually trying to criticize the theories that I used here, and the most interesting thing is that religious institutions have the power and resources to mobilize a community, but they do not do necessarily so because they have high stakes. But at the same time, they do not necessarily facilitate mobilization, because in this case, for instance, the Coptic Orthodox Church always used a discourse of martyrdom, which is grounded in the Coptic history. And for instance, the Copts who were killed in Maspero are now martyrs, because this way they say that they could actually survive, and they have always been always been subject to persecution and victimhood. And also, I would say that the Coptic diaspora's influence is very important. They directly have interaction with the Copts. And then I want to highlight the Egyptian state's role in Upper Egypt, which is not that great because of that the tribes actually, there is the Egyptian government has an unofficial agreement with tribes there, and the security forces are not necessarily there all the time, or they cannot manage their relationships as it is expected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Next up, we have Andrew Wender with his talk entitled Reproaching, Not Merely Reproaching, Religious Sectarianism Within a Tumultuous Middle East. And just want to, again, say we're going to do a Q&A afterwards, and the next panel in this room isn't scheduled until 1:30, so we've got plenty of time.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to the conference organizers for including me. I have been to this conference the last couple of years, and it's really been superb, so thank you. As Sarah was alluding to in my title, and actually as our colleague just before, Ali, was mentioning in his presentation on the Egyptian situation, sectarianism, that phenomenon and that concept are really very much at the heart of a lot of what's being spoken about in the contemporary Middle East. And in my presentation, which is going to be in part reading some of my paper, in part summarizing some of it, what I want to do is offer a critique of the phenomenon and the concept, sectarianism, and argue, really, as the title asserts, that it's not enough to merely reproach, to merely criticize the activities of sectarianism and the way in which sectarianism is depicted. It's really necessary to reapproach it and to rethink the idea from what I try to construct in here as an interdisciplinary perspective, drawing on Middle East politics and history, as well as the theory of religion, and particular disciplinary approaches to religion, one of the most significant being sociology of religion. So I'll go ahead and start. Amidst the churning fluidity of emerging history and violent contestations for power and identity that are today flowing from the Arab uprisings, any observer who tracks current news reporting and commentary, expert analysis, and policymakers' statements concerning the Middle East is bound to be struck by the message that sectarianism is a ubiquitous scourge across the region. Major media outlets embodying a broad spectrum of ideological orientations and political sympathies, based both within and outside the Middle East, participate alongside an international organization like the UN, a state actor like the Syrian government, and myriad individual analysts, from authors working within academe to independent bloggers, in constructing and propelling a train of discourse that depicts an expansive territory from North Africa to South Central Asia as being fissured with sectarian divides and their bitter, typically bloody consequences. Now certainly this discourse has profound internal variability in terms of, for one, the sheer diversity of locales and actors that are regularly referenced. Whether countries at the epicenter of the Arab uprisings, Syria, Egypt, Bahrain, other states, Arab and non-Arab, whose geographic boundaries, internal dynamics, and geostrategic interests are pivotally interlinked with the uprisings, for instance, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran, to name just some of the most key. States that are somewhat further removed spatially from the Arab world, yet inseparable from its constituent phenomena like Sunni-Shi'i relations, such as Pakistan or even Nigeria and Myanmar, where interreligious and interethnic animosities between Muslims and Christians and Arakan Buddhists and Rohingya Muslims respectively are of keen significance for communities and governments more directly situated within the Middle East. Sectarianism discourse is even relevant to a non-state entity like Al-Qaeda, which the iconic British journalist Robert Fisk suggested to be Interestingly, during November 2010, in an apt instance of timing immediately preceding the initial upheavals in Tunisia and Egypt, one of the most sectarian organizations ever invented, as Fisk so termed it. Moreover, to be sure, and as this paper illustrates and discusses, the interpretive standpoints and motivating rationales that inform differing actors' invocation of the concept sectarianism, and yet generally in ways that share the tendency of treating the term, in one fashion or another, as a pejorative label, can be vastly divergent. As an opening example, but one displaying qualities so singularly telling that they are useful to explore in detail at this point, take the case of Syria. That country's extraordinarily complex, brutal, and thus far interminable civil conflict has crystallized in many distinct manifestations of the local, regional, and global imaginations as practically the quintessence of sectarianism. What I do in this part of the paper is I do a comparative analysis of the way in which sectarianism is invoked in the discourse of a number of different international, state, and non-state actors on all sides of the Syrian conflict. So I begin, for example, with the December 2012 UN report from the Human Rights Council indicating that the Syrian conflict has become overtly sectarian in nature. And the Commission cited in particular evidence of government forces and supporting militias attacking Sunni civilians, and as well reports of anti-government armed groups attacking Alawis and other pro-government minority communities, for example, the Armenian Orthodox, other Christian and Druze communities. Then, by quite radical contrast with the UN and with some international reporting, and by international reporting I mean in the paper, in this instance, particularly Western newspapers like the New York Times, then we think about how the Syrian state itself invokes the specter of sectarianism to lambaste those whom President al-Assad recently derided last month as murderous criminals and terrorists, financed by states like Qatar and Saudi Arabia with American blessing. And then on the other side, you see a pro-Sunni writer in a newspaper like Al-Ahram in Egypt being contemptuous of what this particular commentator, Bassel Udat, argued to be the Assad regime's attempt to incite one group or sect against another, together with the government's official rhetoric hurling accusations about the sectarian nature of the uprising. This is what Bassel Udat is very contemptuous of in Al-Ahram. So I ask, with respect to the Syrian illustration, how is one to assess the relative meanings and significances conveyed by these contending applications of the idea of sectarianism to the Syrian scenario? Is it true that the actions of either the Syrian regime or some among the regime's arrayed opponents, or both, are responsible for causing or exacerbating intercommunal divides and conflicts in that country which might be accurately designated as sectarian? Connected with this, and this is really what's really key in my mind, is it valid or appropriate to imply, as does the term sectarian, with its etymological root grounded in what has become, correctly or not, the prejudicially laden word sect, is it valid or appropriate to imply that some forms of religious belief, practice, and identity represented in Syria are normative, while others are somehow deviant and dangerous? And so in deepening the context for the analysis of sectarianism discourse in the Syrian conflict, I now go on to trace the history of some of the dimensions of intercommunal conflict in Syria, looking at the rise to power of the Alawi during the period of French colonialism. I think a little bit about the nature of Alawi religious doctrine and how it is a highly secretive, syncretistic theology. Here I'm quoting Malise Ruthven, containing an amalgam of Neoplatonic, Gnostic, Christian, Muslim, and Zoroastrian elements that, after being created in Iraq a little bit more than a millennium ago, had found refuge in northwestern Syria. As such, the Alawi faith is an excellent example of a syncretistic, esoteric religion with a self-conscious elite who zealously guarded its sectarian literature. There, I'm actually invoking the phrase sectarian as it's used not by Ruthven per se, but by another commentator, but just trying to illustrate what we would need to consider about the different amalgamated religious ideas and identities that are represented in the Alawi tradition in order to be able to really question in a deep and nuanced way, is it appropriate to refer to the Alawi branch of Shi'ism as sectarian? Ultimately, within the Syrian scenario in particular, invoking the notion of sectarianism as if it denotes an aberrant, recently occurring, or at least worsening condition that rational, well-intentioned actors would seek to treat, whomever so invokes it, risks superimposing a problematic caricature of human motivations and conceptions of identity. As a result, using the term sectarianism acts to hinder the sensitive, multi-perspectival understanding and effective policy development necessary to help ameliorate conflict. Now, here's where I start to propose in the paper that if one instead allowed for the possibility that passionate sectarian differences over how humans engage with ultimate reality are not so much inherently abnormal as they are a genuine organic dimension of religious experience and organization, this might better reflect deeply situated, inextricably intertwined, and profoundly held historical elements of human identity formation that can no more be reconceived as solvable problems than can other fundamentally existential quandaries. Alternatively, suppose one were to grant that the idea of the Syrian nation itself is disappearing amid cycles of sectarian bloodshed, and that new forms of socio-political consciousness may need to be imagined for where Syria will have formerly lain, which may, after all, prove to be the situation that's faced at present. This would merely renew the challenge of how such a reimagining can be achieved without falling prey to the antagonizing notion that some among Syria's diverse plurality of believers are pure, whereas others are heretical. This is why in Syria and elsewhere in today's tumultuous Middle East, it is crucial to reapproach, not merely reproach, religious sectarianism. So what ideas and further historical contemporary illustrations might it be productive to explore for advancing this endeavor? At this point in the paper, I go on to explore the contested ideas of sectarianism and its root sect in Middle East studies and generally. So first I trace the way in which the concept has been used but also critiqued by writers like Usama Makdisi in reference to Lebanon, so moving beyond Syria. And in tracing a number of different scholarly approaches, I find that on the whole, various sources exploring the phenomenon and concept of sectarianism in Middle East history and politics almost uniformly underscore the dark connotations of the term, whether it's evoked within the Middle East or from outside the Middle East with reference to the region. Thus, as Fanar Haddad explains with respect to Iraq, in Iraq, as elsewhere in the Middle East, the term sectarianism is an irrevocably negative term. Sectarianism, indeed even sect, often conjures images of repression, discrimination, division, treachery, and weakness. As one Middle Eastern analyst lamented, sectarianism is so sensitive an issue that merely discussing it is in itself considered evidence of sectarian attitudes. In addition, authors caution against imprecise usages of the term, not least by academic and policy-oriented analysts, that would impute essential religion-based societal fissures to a Middle East thereby viewed inferentially through an Orientalist lens. Consistent with this, Haddad and others go on to elaborate how sectarianism must be viewed on a case-by-case basis as a varying embodiment of specific, historically constituted local conditions involving unique interplays among, for instance, religion, ethnicity, language, geography, class, nationalisms, and further elements of political climate. Only in such a vein is it argued by people like Usama Makdisi, only in such a vein can analysts surmount the traditional Orientalist paradigm of sectarianism, which began crystallizing in the 19th century and has quite literally exploded following the events of 9/11. This was something that Makdisi had said before the Arab uprisings, and I would argue that this Orientalist paradigm of sectarianism has perhaps only intensified in the wake of the Arab uprisings. Makdisi's well-placed suspicion of those who would imagine sectarianism to be an ingredient timelessly planted in the soil of the Middle East, ready to spring forth in ever-appearing outgrowths from age-old holy wars, fits with his particular understanding of sectarianism in Lebanon as the modern product, during the mid to late 19th century and subsequently, of intersecting political ambitions on the part of imperial as well as local actors. In other words, on Makdisi's view, sectarianism refers to the deployment of religious heritage as a primary marker of modern political identity. Moreover, Makdisi's analysis serves to underscore the inherent hypocrisy of the notion that the modern West somehow stands antithetical to sectarianism. For as writers like John Gray have intimated, Western modernity is a category marked by nothing so much as its amalgamation of competing visions for worldly salvation, which amount to sects, rendered in such ideological forms as communism and neoliberalism. Yet, ponder the implications of the idea that the modern Western civilizational setting associated with propagating Orientalism actually seems eminently prone to the various sorts of overlapping fissures of belief and socio-political identity that Orientalists ascribe to the East. And consider further the notion that Western and Eastern sectarian fissures, with Western and Eastern very much in quotes, are in no small part constitutive of one another. Might this realization lend credence to the possibility that sectarianism, in fact, simply refers to a basic human force linking the development and eventual splintering of worldviews with a transformational restructuring of politics, society, and other facets of civilization? Here I'm starting to move into the realm of sociology of religion and using the work of Shmuel Eisenstadt, great sociologist of religion who thought a lot about the concept of sectarianism and where it fits in relation to overall human religious history. Referenced hereby is Eisenstadt's understanding of how, extending from the epoch of modernity back into the first millennium BCE and early first millennium CE so-called axial civilizations, for example, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, ancient Greece, Christianity, the setting in which modernity itself is genealogically grounded, sectarian tensions between orthodoxy and heterodoxy have in fact acted as one of the most influential drivers of revolutionary changes and transformations in human history. Eisenstadt's insights are revealing especially within the context of the scholarly subdiscipline that is most closely associated with the study of sects and sectarianism, that is the sociology of religion. As such, he helps to surmount the pejorative coloring that the Latin root secta, meaning to follow, did not actually acquire for a long time. In fact, did not actually acquire, in certain respects, until modern sociology of religion only 100 years ago or so, through the work of people like Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch, went on to develop the concept of sect as a category with a connotation of deviance about it. The idea that a sect is something which splits off from a normative church. And then in the popular imagination, even only by the mid to later 20th century, did sect start to become conflated together with cult. And so one of the things I argue in here is that in reapproaching, not merely reproaching sectarianism, it's necessary to dig into the way sociology of religion has treated the concept and has led to popular cultural notions that sect equates to deviance, and that therefore sectarian activity is to be unflinchingly condemned because it somehow relates to to deviance. And this is what I'm really trying to critique in here. Finally, it leads us to the question, is religious sectarianism a real, distorted, or purely imagined element of the historical and contemporary Middle East? The modern intellectual setting giving rise to sociology of religion, when read together with this paper's preceding discussions of, for example, the 19th and 20th century historical environments promoting sectarianism in Lebanon, and indeed the seeming ubiquity of sectarianism today in the wake of the Arab uprisings, could lead one to gravitate towards the disorienting impression that we're addressing a phenomenon of relatively recent origins. And indeed, there may be something that is peculiarly, but not uniquely, modern about sectarianism. And one of the arguments I make here is that modernity brings with it a profound dislocation of belief and identity, which helps to promote sectarianism because people are, to put it quite bluntly, grasping for sources of meaning. And basic sources of meaning are under renegotiation. However, notwithstanding the modern world's arguable propensity towards the cultivation of sectarianism, it's vital to call back to mind the notion that sects may constitute, withal, an integral facet of humankind's religious life that cannot be ascribed a priori a good or bad normative value, and that sects may comprise further a natural element of civilization's historical development. So here I end up by bringing this back to one of the most profound overarching contexts for sectarianism discourse in the contemporary and historical Middle East, and that's the Sunni-Shi'i divide. So I say that this all raises in turn the delicate question, and it is indeed a delicate question, of whether sectarianism is in fact a phenomenon basic to the historical and contemporary Middle East in the form of, perhaps above all, the Sunni-Shi'i divide and its subsequent splits within the Shi'i community in particular, giving rise to branches of Shi'ism such as the Zaydis in Yemen, Ismailis and Ithna Asharis, or Twelvers, who are of course predominant in Iran, Iraq and southern Lebanon. But as we think about the way in which Sunni-Shi'i history and the contemporary status of Sunni-Shi'i relations are represented, it's crucial to parse the ways in which Sunni-Shi'i sectarianism is depicted so that we can help reveal the interests and presuppositions underlying depictions of ostensible intra-Islamic religious conflict. So here I think about things like, Sarah, you're a scholar of Jordan, King Abdullah's invocation of the Shi'i crescent in 2004, and I say it's a famous or infamous invocation of the Shi'i crescent, depending on what one's perspective is on what King Abdullah's interests and presuppositions were when he so invoked it. And I also wade into something that has emerged as a bit of a debate between Vali Nasser, the author of the book The Shi'i Revival, and then Hamid Dabashi, who is very critical of Nasser's analysis in the Shi'i Revival, arguing that it amounts to a reductionist caricature of Shi'ism, and a reductionist caricature of such seemingly essential sectarian splits between Sunni and Shia, when Dabashi makes, in contrast, what is becoming his increasingly well-known argument, that the Islamic tradition is in fact a fundamentally cosmopolitan Islamic tradition. A cosmopolitan religious tradition, to use Dabashi's term, in which speaking of Sunni-Shi'i sectarianism is fundamentally problematic because, in fact, during the full flow of Islamic history, there's been so much exchange across that supposed denominational divide. But this all leads us back to the still remaining question. Even as we think about all these representations, is there nonetheless a concrete reality to sectarianism in today's Middle East that lies beyond competing political appropriations and manipulations of, and impassioned interpretive divergences over this incendiary concept? And so here's where I conclude. There is a great deal of potency to a number of the critiques, and for that matter, to some of the scorn directed against both the varying practices and representations of sectarianism in the contemporary Middle East. whether in the wake of the Arab uprisings themselves or at the confluence between those recent events and prior historical processes. Numerous episodes of searing violence and hostility do seem to involve intercommunal struggles over intertwined religious and political power and identity. But within these contexts, the term sectarianism emerges as a weapon as well as a signifier, by means of which actors across the ideological spectrum accuse one another of heinous crimes and a suspect level of humanity. However, reductive caricatures of sectarianism, undertaken by those involved in the struggles as well as by those depicting the phenomenon from outside, do not help matters. If anything, these depictions may distort and inflame in ways that occlude meaningful recognition of the power with which differences among religious and ideological worldviews do in fact shape persons' perceptions of reality. In his recent book, The Tribal Imagination, the anthropologist Robin Fox suggests that human beings are very much sectarian creatures, whose ethnographic dazzle of differences, for example in religious and political sects, to use Fox's words, answers to the low and persistent mammalian drumbeats that impel the dispersal and migration of ideas. While the specific cultural and historical factors that render the formation of sects at some points relatively quiescent, whereas at other times sectarianism seems to explode, are not well understood. However, the singular tumult in today's Middle East may exemplify the eruption of vast social changes that act as these sorts of factors. Whether or not one concurs in whole or in part with Fox's disciplinary frame of reference, very much anthropological, and with its orientation towards unearthing biological seeds of sectarianism, his overall point resonates in the light of human history. Perhaps considering today's tumultuous Middle East as a setting for unique manifestations of an ongoing human historical experience, rather than as a peculiarly atavistic time and place, is a useful step towards reimagining forms of political recognition that can honor and respect, rather than seek to parody and conceal profoundly held yet shared differences in identity. Thanks very much.
At this point, we'll open it up to questions. You can take the 10 minutes or so that's allotted in the program now after the three speakers have gone. So, anyone would like to start? Go ahead.
I direct the question to Professor Paul Rowe. With regards to the uncertainty of Coptic Christians in Egypt, the last few years, with minorities of Christians throughout the Middle East reducing, I believe, wasn't Egypt the home for a lot of immigrants from other parts of the region into Egypt as a next location, or leaving their own area, whether it be Jordan or Syria or even Israel? But on a broader picture is, what do you see the future with the Christians when the minorities get smaller and they become even more threatened and stable, where they will be able to go in today's tighter world where there's less opportunities with student visas, and colonialism has changed and there's no automatic route to France, England, elsewhere. Is this in itself, in the perspective of the Christian communities in the area that aren't necessarily tied together, other than just religion or sociology, can you expand anywhere that might happen?
Wow, there's a lot in there. So I'll try to do it quickly. But as far as exile communities coming to Egypt, I never really discovered a huge amount of that in Egypt. In the Egyptian case, Jordan. Jordan is the location where they've all come from Iraq, now from Syria, from other places as well, and historically Lebanon to an extent. But Egypt would generally be, there's not a lot of immigration to Egypt from other areas as a sanctuary, at least to my knowledge. The other aspect of it, the question of demographic decline, just generally. You're absolutely right. At some point, okay, first of all, to understand in context, Egypt is the largest Christian community in the Middle East by absolute numbers. So somewhere around 8 million Christians in Egypt. And in other countries, they are a dwindling minority in most places. Even Lebanon, where the Christian community was proportionally the largest, that proportion is declining over time, and Lebanese are leaving. Lebanese Christians are leaving. Palestinian Christians are leaving. Iraqi Christians have gone droves. So you're absolutely right. There's a demographic decline, and there's a point at which it's going to end because, as you suggest, especially in the Egyptian case, there are people without the ability to simply emigrate. Wealthy people in Egypt who are Copts tend to have dual citizenship anyway. I know lots of them. That's not going to continue to persist because there's a lot of Copts who are not as prosperous as well. You go to Egypt, the Copts are at every level. The richest people in Egypt are Copts, and some of the poorest people in Egypt are Copts. You go to the east end of Cairo, the garbage village is mostly Copts, and so those people who are not going to have an easy time emigrating because of the economics of it. So my interest is in understanding what their survival strategies are going to be. There are places where people are basically adamantly saying, we're not going to leave anymore because we've been called to this place, or this place is where my ancestors lived, I'm not going to leave. And so how do they develop the idea, the Arabic term would be samud. How do we develop steadfastness? How do we stay in this place? So I'm interested in developing and understanding how they're going to do that.
California, I heard on NPR, California had a huge influx of Copts. They're taking them in as refugees.
But that's not easy through government regulations.
It seems to be. They said thousands have come just recently to the United States.
Yeah, if foreign actors want to promote Coptic immigration or immigration of other Christians, then certainly that's going to accelerate the process.
Another question?
I had a quick follow-up. You mentioned this 1930 edict.
Right.
That sounded to me like classic dimitude. So what is the difference?
What's the difference? Oh, yeah, well, it's the reinforcement under the Republican regimes of the system that applied during the Ottoman Empire.
So exactly, it's an ancient principle of
Well,
you cannot construct churches and you cannot do X, Y, Z.
It's not ancient. It actually dated back to the 1850s when during the Tanzimat reforms in the Ottoman Empire, they wanted to codify how do we exactly treat Christians. Up until that time, it was much more arbitrary. So the attempt by the Ottoman court, by the government, to create a set of rules for how you treat Millis all across the empire, and in part because of foreign empires trying to force them into it over the centuries up until that point.